This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and in the early hours of Tuesday, the 1st of January, these are our main stories. In a televised address to the nation, the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has insisted he can resolve the challenges facing his country. At least one protester was shot dead during another day of anti-government demonstrations. The World Food Programme has told Houthi rebels in Yemen to stop stealing food aid in parts of the country under their control. The US Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren takes a big step towards entering the 2020 presidential race. Also in this podcast,
something has been kept in the deep freeze ever since it was formed, and we have no idea what to expect. It's just going to be a complete writing the textbook from scratch experience.
A spacecraft is set to observe a space object more than 6 billion kilometres from Earth. First to Sudan. The sound of protests and the firing of tear gas outside the presidential palace in Khartoum. Inside, the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, in a televised address to the nation, has insisted he has a roadmap to resolve the economic crisis facing his country. Mr Bashir promised an election would be held in 2020, but didn't say whether he would seek another term in office. At least one protester was shot dead as Sudanese security forces protected the complex. Yusra Ebagir is a freelance journalist in Khartoum. She came into contact with the security forces.
Just moments before I was caught secretly filming, I saw a normal civilian walking down the street getting beaten and manhandled by security officers for lifting up his phone. He hadn't even filmed yet, but, just the thought or the prospect of, him filming had them already, abusing him and showing force. And moments later, I was caught, and I experienced quite aggressive force from security officers. The car was locked, but they heavily, attacked hit the windows. They were going to break the windows. They were, trying to get at us anywhere. And then I unlocked the door and handed a burner local phone that I was using, and kept, the phone that had the sensitive footage and had my, interactions with journalists from different media outlets. But they grabbed me by the shirt. They ripped my shirt down the middle. They hit the cameraman who was driving at the time on the back of his neck. They shook me until I handed my phone over. And then they, when I've handed it over, they said, "Don't film again," screamed it in my face. And, this is under the assumption that they just thought I was a normal civilian, not a journalist actually covering the story. I don't know what would have happened if they'd confirmed that I was actually covering the protest. So what we've seen is that they don't want the world to be able to watch how they're treating protesters on the streets of Khartoum.
Gillian Lusk is a British-based independent journalist specialising in Sudan. She told the BBC's James Coomarasamy what she'd learned about the protests in Khartoum.
Well, it's not only tear gas that's been used, I'm afraid, but they've been using live ammunition, the Sudan security forces, and at least 2 people have been shot in the head. This is very serious. These are unarmed civilians, and they're being shot by their own governments. So people are rather disappointed that the world isn't saying very much about it at the moment over Christmas.
What's at the root of these protests?
The government has been there for nearly 30 years next June. It's never ceased to be brutal and Islamist during that time. It's a very corrupt and very brutal regime. It's not just a question of President Omar al-Bashir himself. It's a question of the whole party which rules, and it rules through the security services. So I'm afraid people are used to brutality, and I think they've just had enough.
Yes, because they're not used to getting out on the streets like this, though, are they?
No, there were quite big protests in September 2013, and then at least 200 people, again, unarmed civilians, were shot dead in the streets. But since then, it's been relatively quiet. But there is a tradition of civilian uprising in Sudan. They've overthrown 2 military governments, and they're referring back to that. They're seeing this as the people taking power again.
But at the moment, the power, that the brute force at least, seems to be with the government itself and the security forces.
That's right, but it's, of course, what we don't know, and what is almost impossible to find out, is what's going on within the regime, both within the security service, within the army, which is not necessarily in agreement with the security service, within the ruling party, within the presidential palace, because President Omar al-Bashir is not that popular necessarily within his own party. So you've got all these possible, definite pressures within the regime, and we can't really know what will happen in that respect. Will there be an internal coup? What would happen?
And how is President Bashir handling things so far?
Very aggressively. I mean, yesterday he spoke to senior police officers. He promised them cars. He promised them pay rises. He used a phrase which is very similar to saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They should respond with force against the protesters.
Gillian Lusk. The BBC contacted the Sudanese government, but as we record this podcast, no comment has yet been received. The conflict in Yemen has created a crisis over access to food. The UN believes some 10 million people in the country don't know where their next meal is coming from. Now the World Food Programme says food aid meant for the starving is being stolen and sold in areas including the capital Sana'a, which are controlled by Houthi rebels. WFP monitors have gathered evidence of trucks illegally removing food from designated distribution areas, with rations sold on the open market or given to those not entitled to it. The organisation is trying to get food aid to the millions of people who are suffering from severe hunger. I spoke to our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher, and asked him for more on the WFP report.
It's concentrating on one side of a conflict, the Houthi rebels who control the capital Sana'a and control much of the north of the country. So, there are still millions of Yemenis who essentially live under their authority, under their administration. What the WFP is saying is that aid is getting into these areas, but it's not reaching the people that it's supposed to, that fraud is being committed, where at distribution centres the wrong list of names is being given, that a lot of the food is ending up on the open market. It says that at least one of the groups that it works with, supposedly to help distribute the food, is clearly committing fraud. So it's a very strong statement by the WFP. Aid agencies have tried not to point the blame so much at the Houthi rebels, in a sense, because they don't want them to break off that cooperation, which is so essential. But the executive director has said, that it's an outrage, that essentially they are committing a crime which is happening as children are dying because they don't have enough to eat in Yemen.
So, do we know what percentage is being misappropriated?
Percentages and numbers aren't given, but the sense is that it's a lot. Which is concerning because a lot of aid is going into Yemen. It's unclear a lot of the time. We hear all the time, that millions and millions of people are on the brink of famine, certainly many in, desperately short of the food supplies that they need. But there is aid that gets in. The figures are, I think, around $4 billion worth has gone in this year. And that always seems a slight mismatch when we're hearing about the desperate situation there. This makes that picture a bit clearer that, yes, the aid is getting in, but it's not reaching the areas. And what the WFP says is that all the distribution centres that it has across the country, across the Houthi-controlled areas, it can only monitor about 20% of those. So it doesn't know what's going on, in many of them.
As you said, many people, many children are dying of starvation.
Yes. There are estimates that maybe up to 80,000 children have died during the almost 4 years of the war because of the shortages that the war has brought in. The official figure of civilian deaths is still stuck around 10,000, but, many groups working there say that the figure is 5-10 times bigger than that because of all the consequences from the war.
Sebastian Usher. The US Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren has announced she's establishing an exploratory committee to look into running for president in 2020. She's the first high-profile Democrat to put herself forward for the race. Ms. Warren made the announcement in a video posted to her Twitter account in which she outlined her vision for the United States.
Because no matter what our differences, most of us want the same thing, to be able to work hard, play by the same set of rules, and take care of the people we love. That's the America I'm fighting for. And that's why today I'm launching an exploratory committee for president. But the outcome of this election will depend on you. This is what democracy looks like. In the last 2 years, millions of people have done more than they ever thought they would to protect the promise of America. And here's what we learned. If we organize together, if we fight together, if we persist together, We can win. We can, and we will.
The US presidential election is still some way off in November 2020. We asked our correspondent in Washington, Gary O'Donoghue, if this is a good time for potential candidates to start putting themselves forward.
Yeah, this is about right. I mean, there's a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, thinking about launching their campaigns at this sort of stage. They will want to start organising, they'll want to start raising money. They'll even be going to these early primary states, places like New Hampshire, places like Iowa, even though those primaries and caucuses aren't for a year yet. They have to get in there first. So it's not surprising that Elizabeth Warren has done this. It's a step short of a formal announcement. It does allow her to start doing some things without having some of the constraints of launching a formal campaign in terms of federal election law, etc. But I think there's few people here that really think there's any doubt that she will throw her hat into the ring on this one. And she has a very high profile, not least because of her clashes with President Trump, who has nicknamed her derisively Pocahontas because of her claims for Native American ancestry, something that led her to have a DNA test earlier this year. And of course, something that has been seen by many as a kind of racial slur by the president when he uses that term. So there's plenty of name recognition for her out there. But she's on the left of the party. She won't be. I don't think she'll be the only candidate from that wing. You'll remember how well Bernie Sanders ran Hillary Clinton last time for the Democratic nomination. He may decide to run again, in which case he'd have a lot of grassroots organisation already out there, a lot of money raising capacity, etc. And he demonstrated, if you like, that you could motivate that progressive wing of the party and the young people in particular involved in it, even if you are a 70-plus-year-old senator. And Elizabeth Warren will be 71 by the time she became president, if she got through those two hurdles.
Gary O'Donoghue in Washington. Also in the podcast.
So, Prime Minister, you've drawn a sword against your own people, and now the people have drawn their swords against you.
As opposition to the government of Viktor Orban grows, we ask, what can Hungary expect from 2019? Brazil's new president is being sworn in later on Tuesday. The far-right Jair Bolsonaro won power, promising to end corrupt politics and boost the economy. But his campaign was a frequently hostile one, threatening minority groups and making many fear he'll put business interests ahead of the protection of Brazil's large indigenous population and environmental concerns. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports from Brazil's agricultural heartland, Mato Grosso do Sul.
All visitors to the Guapoi Amambai reservation are welcomed with a prayer. People from the Kiowa tribe are tapping their bare feet and large bamboo poles on the dry red mud floors of the thatched prayer hall, while the cacique or chieftain shakes a rattle shaped from a gourd. Tradition here is everything, but it's a way of life that's under threat. In Mato Grosso do Sul, much of the land has been taken over by farmers' crops. But as well as being Brazil's breadbasket, the state is home to the second largest indigenous population after the Amazon. It's here where indigenous communities wanting their ancestral lands back are pitted against powerful farming interests wanting a profit, often ending in violent conflict. Bolsonaro has said he won't give a centimetre more land to indigenous communities once he's president. For indigenous leaders like Eliseo Lopes, Bolsonaro represents a huge threat.
Violence will only increase. Accused of dragging down the economy, of squatting on people's land, we are treated worse than animals. We have our own culture, our own way of living, our own language. Our rights need to be respected.
Estamos vizinhos da aldeia, mas eu tenho há 35 anos aqui.
I meet farmer Nivaldo Kruger, who's spraying pesticides on his soya crops as the sun sets, trying to avoid the intense heat of these summer months. He tells me his rights count too. He points out the fields his family has worked for more than 30 years. In one corner, indigenous communities have tried to take back land. He's fed up fighting and thinks Bolsonaro will be on his side.
There are big expectations. I think we are going to turn a page. The new government believes in the importance of agriculture industry for Brazil. These indigenous people need to be involved in society and live like any other citizen. They don't need more land because they aren't producing.
The fear is, though, that with Bolsonaro in power, farmers will feel emboldened and the rights of the indigenous will fall by the wayside. Jair Bolsonaro's bid for presidency showed a very negative, racist side of Brazil, says State Prosecutor Marco Antonio Delfino.
You are worried about the hate speech, for sure. It's a kind of trigger from violence, and that people use hate speech that was like kind of common in the campaign.
Bolsonaro has made it clear where his allegiances lie, leaving indigenous communities wondering what this new president will mean for their future.
That report by Katie Watson in Brazil. The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, is no stranger to controversy, particularly over the tactics in his so-called war on drugs. Now, his latest remarks about touching a maid sexually while she slept have created outrage in the country. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton, told me more.
Rodrigo Duterte appeared in front of a large group of supporters. He was supposed to be giving a speech about land distribution. But he went on one of his famous rants. He went on a tangent. And this time he went back to one of his favorite topics, which is criticizing the Catholic Church. Mr. Duterte is known to be a fierce critic of the church in the Philippines. And he started talking about how he referred to an incident when he was a teenager. He said that the maid who lived in the family home, this is very common in the Philippines to have some home help. He entered her room while she was sleeping and he touched her underneath her clothes. I won't go into more detail, but he did. He then left the room when she woke up a little bit and then went back into the room again and touched her underneath her clothes again. Now, by many accounts, by almost all accounts, this constitutes a rape, sexual assault. Mr. Duterte was laughing a bit as he said this, and he was trying to use this as an anecdote to explain how when he was a teenager, his local Catholic priest would push him to confess something when he went to confession. And he used this as an example of something that he confessed.
And what's been the reaction?
Well, there's been a quite understandable reaction from the typical opposition groups who you would expect to react. So we've seen calls for Mr. Duterte's resignation from one of the big opposition parties that represents women's interests. They said that he has proven himself unworthy of his position. A few of the other opposition parties have also joined in. We've also heard from teachers' unions who've really expressed alarm at the way in which Mr. Duterte confessed this. He didn't seem to have any shame. He didn't really seem to feel any guilt, or it really seemed to feel that he was admitting to a crime when he was talking about this. It really is odd to read his words and to hear him say these words because he's almost laughing as he's saying it.
Celia Hatton. For Hungary, 2019 will probably mean new protests against the nationalist populist Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Fidesz government. An unpopular law increasing the number of hours of overtime an employer can ask employees to work was rushed through Parliament by the government in mid-December, sparking nationwide demonstrations. Our Budapest correspondent Nick Thorpe looks at the growing resentment against the country's populist leader.
The sound of whistles, sirens and clapping in the Hungarian parliament on the 12th of December as two new laws were forced through parliament by Fidesz, despite the efforts of several dozen opposition MPs over several hours to prevent the vote. The whole scandal was broadcast live on Facebook by opposition MP Bence Tordai. He then led the united opposition out of the chamber. Thanks for watching, he told hundreds of thousands of viewers. Now we continue on the street. And so they did. Outside Parliament, protesters confronted riot police. Protesters also marched on the state television, where opposition MPs managed to get inside, while the crowd chanted "Factory of Lies" at the staunch government-controlled station from the street outside. The government was unimpressed. Its spokesman, Zoltán Kovács, blamed the protests, as usual, on the Hungarian-born financier and philanthropist George Soros.
In face of the claims that are coming mostly NGOs and political activists financed by Mr. Soros and his organizations, in face of that political campaign against the country for the past 8 years, I suggest you stick to the facts and solid facts on the ground, actually, and you take a deeper look and closer look at what is happening in Hungary.
But if one takes that closer look, one finds something rather interesting happening, something more like what's happening in France. Outside the huge Mercedes plant in Kecskemét in central Hungary, a protest convoy of cars, flying an assortment of national, political and trade union flags, sets out for the centre of the city. In the main square, under the Christmas trees, I spoke to some of those taking part.
As an employer, I say this is rubbish. This law is rubbish. This law is against anything, lifestyle, life, family. It kills the family, so it's not good for me.
As workers at Mercedes, the biggest employer in this country, we felt we should take part in the protests too, to show our solidarity with all the other workers in Hungary and stop the government implementing this overtime law.
Meanwhile, on one of the vehemently pro-government TV stations, Here TV, the spokesman of the opposition Jobbik party, Péter Jakab, issued a 15-minute tirade against the Prime Minister to viewers who'd never heard or seen anything quite like it before.
So, Prime Minister, you've drawn a sword against your own people, and now the people have drawn their swords against you. So I'm asking you now, lay down your weapon, abolish this slave law, restore independent public service media, restore the independence of the courts, and join the European Prosecutor's Office.
Plain speech which everyone in Hungary can understand. And it's the involvement of politicians like Péter Jakab and of workers and trade unionists which gives the new opposition in Hungary a fire in its belly. So could Viktor Orbán, the arch-populist, and his Fidesz elite face a real challenge from an even more populist movement on the streets of Hungary in 2019.
Nick Thorpe in Budapest. As we record this podcast, a spacecraft is set to observe a space object more than 6 billion kilometres from Earth in the early hours of 2019. The New Horizons probe will collect data and take pictures of the icy cosmic object called Ultima Thule, the farthest object ever to be photographed by humans. Elizabeth Pearson, news editor of the Sky at Night magazine, says it's in the region of space called the Kuiper Belt.
The Kuiper Belt is filled with the sort of leftover remnants of the solar system formation. These are the bits that didn't make it into planets. And if we can understand why they didn't become planets, then it helps us understand a bit more about what it is that makes a planet grow and how our own planets formed, why they're the composition that they are. But it also shows us what was around at the very beginning of the solar system.
For more on the mission, here's our science correspondent, Jonathan Amos.
New Horizons has already made space exploration history with the first ever visit to the dwarf planet Pluto just over 3 years ago. Since then, the probe has pushed even deeper into space and is now about to sweep past its next target. Ultima Thule is a big block of frozen material left over from the formation of the solar system. New Horizons will be grabbing gigabytes of pictures and other scientific data as it hurtles past at 14 kilometres a second. Scientists think Ultima may have preserved within its form and chemistry the conditions that existed right at the start of the solar system, some 4.6 billion years ago. If that's so, Ultima could help explain how all the planets, including Earth, came into being. Alan Stern is New Horizons' chief scientist.
It's a completely unknown type of object, something that's been kept in the deep freeze at just 40 degrees above absolute zero ever since it was formed. And we have no idea what to expect. It's just going to be a complete writing the textbook from scratch experience.
The mission scientists will have to be patient, however. Slow data rates mean it'll take almost 2 years to download all the pictures.
Jonathan Amos. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. From everybody here, a very happy new year. Until next time, bye-bye.